Okay, all of you who are online, I want to thank you so much for your patience here. We are in Texas and we have an audience also in California. So I want to go ahead and officially get started. It's been a little hectic here trying to get the logistics going with technical, but hey, we human beings can solve anything. Any crisis put before us, we can solve it. Thank God. So, all right. So people are coming in, and let me just welcome everyone. My name is Keisha Rogers, and I want to welcome you to our special LaRouche PAC hosted event. This discussion is coming at a time where we are now celebrating, or should I say more so, commemorating 5 years of a tragedy of Hurricane Harvey here in Texas. But as we gather here, we are in Texas. We have people listening to this webinar from all over the country. We have an audience here in Houston live. We also have an audience in California. And we decided to host this meeting at this very pertinent time in our nation to discuss the causes and solutions to dealing with the water crisis and drought that is devastating our nation. Because as we know, in some parts of the country, we're dealing with a massive drought. In other areas, you're seeing people facing devastating floods. And as people are looking back at the tragedy and horror that we faced back in 5 years ago with Hurricane Harvey, I will tell you, I was just completely appalled and disgusted to see that people are not talking about the infrastructure that needs to be built. How do we actually bring water down into the drought-stricken areas? How do we actually put forth the type of infrastructure that's needed to help to save our farms that are being destroyed, and also to put forth the infrastructure that's needed to make sure that in the areas where we are having massive flooding, that we can actually channel that water into areas that's needed. And so, one of the things we're going to discuss, and I'm happy to have two very qualified speakers who are going to be talking to us tonight, talking to us today, and Brian Lance and Pat Ruckert. And so Brian is here with me in Texas, and Patrick Ruckert is going to be speaking to us from California. And they know a lot about the about what is needed to address the crisis because of the long time work that they both have been doing in collaboration with one of the greatest economic statesmen who has now since passed away, Mr. Lyndon LaRouche, who was putting forth programs and actually introducing programs that go back, and they will be discussing this in their presentation, to the period of another great presidential leader, President John F. Kennedy. And even before that, they will be discussing some of the programs that have been on the books for a very long time, that if we had the budget and we weren't dealing with those who want to stop economic development, stop the development of the physical economy by trying to blame everything on human beings and blame everything on climate change, which is a complete hoax. I mean, you wouldn't believe it that at the period where, we look back on what could have been done to save so many homes, so many lives during Hurricane Harvey, the tragedy of lives lost, of people who lost everything. And you say it's 5 years later, what have we done to address that crisis? And I was looking at articles today, if you type in Hurricane Harvey 5 years later, and you're going to see, well, Hurricane Harvey was inequitable. You know, Hurricane Harvey was caused by climate change, and it hit people, Latinx people, like in more disproportionately than anybody else. Well, I have to tell you, here in Texas, one of the areas that got wiped off the map was Rockport, Texas, and there's not a whole lot of Latinx people or you know, whatever this crazy term, that gender equity term or whatever they want to call it. But you know, the fact of the matter is, it's criminal negligence that we haven't built the infrastructure that's been needed to save lives. This has nothing to do with green climate change agenda. And that's why what we are seeing, I make this point before I introduce my speakers here, from what we're seeing from the Biden administration, what we've been seeing for far too long is that we have not committed to the national infrastructure and mission that's needed. What we've been doing is actually tearing down our national infrastructure and focusing more on climate change, climate agendas, and saying that human beings is the problem and we need to get rid of human beings. Now, couple of solutions here that I just want to say in introducing, first of all, let me just let people know that how we're going to run today's discussion. As said, I really appreciate all of you who have joined us for this special event. LaRouche PAC is hosting here, and we usually have our meetings on Saturdays. This is the first time in a while that we've had what we call a hybrid meeting. So we have a great audience here in the room with me, and I appreciate them joining. I know there's an audience in the room there in California. What we're going to do is, once our speakers are done speaking, we're going to try to run things a little bit differently in this webinar session, which is we will have special guests who are joining us online, candidates who will speak, who will address questions to our speakers. And I'll take a couple of questions from the audience here for the speaker in California, who will be the first one to speak. And then I will take a couple of questions from California from the live audience for Brian Lance here, who will speak. So as I want to introduce Pat Ruckert here, one thing I will introduce him with is that Pat has been a longtime writer on the subject of water, the drought in the Western states. He writes a weekly report that has come out since the 2014, I believe it is. And his latest report just came out yesterday. For those who are here in the room, that we actually have some copies of this report on the back table there, and we'll make it available online for others as well. And the report, California Drought and Infrastructure Report, with expanded coverage of all the Western states. And he's going to go through his report and also go through the question of what solutions are there to solve the water crisis. And the point is leadership. This is what we're going to talk about. Why leadership is missing, the missing element. We had leadership, the potential for leadership, and this is why he's become such a threat under President Donald Trump. Because under President Donald Trump, instead of having all of this shenanigans that are being run right now, if he was still in the White House, we would be discussing the types of solutions as he's done through many of his presentations and rallies that he's done, denounced this whole green climate agenda and has made clear that there are solutions to the crisis. And so this is what we're dealing with right now, is that we have leadership who is completely out of touch with the population and what's needed in the population. And that's why we're having this meeting, because we have people here who know what it takes and to provide leadership. And I encourage anybody running for office who's on here, or once this broadcast is over, share this with people who are running for office, because if this is not the subject that they're addressing at this critical time, then they're out of touch, because everybody knows that the number one issue on people's minds right now is the economy, is what's happening to our physical economy. They don't care about all of this other stuff, gender equity and everything else that's being put out there. What they care about is, do we have farms? Do we have food? Do we have water? And are our cows being destroyed? Are we facing worse drought conditions than in the period of the Dust Bowl? And our speakers will let us know what's really going on. So I'm going to, with that, go ahead and turn it over to Pat Ruckert. Is going to be our first speaker here. All right. Okay, Pat, so I think you're on, and I'm going to turn it over to you to get started. Thank you.
Thank you, Keisha. Now, let me begin with moving back 5 days ago to the LaRouche PAC strategic briefing. And in that briefing, Mike Steger said that any system, any nation that would tolerate, even for a short period of time. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
There's
I'm getting some feedback here. Hold on. Okay. That any nation or economy that would tolerate over 100,000 overdose deaths per year, as we have had for the last 5 years, is a system, it's an economy that is completely bankrupt and must be replaced. That's what the LaRouche PAC movement has always stated for more than 50 years. And it is more critical than ever that actually occur. Now, Keisha mentioned the report I do weekly, the California Water and Infrastructure Report. And I've been writing that for more than 8 years now. And it is essentially a chronology of the drought in California, and now more broadly, as the current drought is not only devastating the Southwest states, but also now is spread to more than 60% of the country. In fact, over the last 2 weeks, Massachusetts and Rhode Island have entered into extreme drought. So the, still not getting it, Hunter? Okay, so let's go back about 90 years ago to begin with, right? And this is 1933. California government and legislature wanted to build the Central Valley Project, but it was in the depth of the Depression. It had no capability to finance it. So President Franklin Roosevelt stepped in, and the Central Valley Project began construction in a matter of weeks from the time that Roosevelt said, we're going to build it. About the same time, the essentially shut down building of the of Hoover Dam by, in fact, President Hoover at the time. Because of the Depression, Roosevelt started that up again. And so that was 90 years ago. And by the 1960s, the dozens of dams, reservoirs, aqueducts, canals that the Central Valley project actually is, was pretty much completed. And in 1962, Governor Pat Brown in California, whose maybe most horrible legacy is his son Jerry Brown. But Governor Pat Brown said, that we need more water projects. We need to ensure that the state of California, all the people, all the agriculture are able to have access to adequate water supplies. And Pat Brown began then the building of the California State Water Project, which began on the Shasta River, flowed through the Central Valley, up and over the Tehachapi Mountains, and into Southern California, all the way to San Diego. That is a 600-mile water project. And the two projects together, along with a third project, that is the Colorado River Aqueduct from Lake Mead or Lake Hanasavu, south of Lake Mead, then sends about 1.5 million acre feet of water from the Colorado River into Southern California. Right? So by 1972, all these projects are completed. And in summary, what the California water management system actually accomplished was to be the largest and most complex water management system in the world. And to this day, it is still holds that record, with the potential exception of the Move South Water North project now underway in China. But for the first time in human history, multiple river systems were united into one water management arrangement that today the state of California produces more than 50% of all the fruit and vegetables produced by the entire country. Now think about that. And what we are looking at now is what some studies have labeled the worst drought in 1,200 years. But how did we go from a population of 20 million in California with adequate water supplies in 1972 to 50 years later now, in the worst drought and water crisis that has ever been experienced since the state was actually founded in 1850. Right? That's what we have to discuss. And that's not my role today, but it's always the role of LaRouche PAC in all of our broadcasts, right? So but it was the shift in our culture, the rise of the counterculture, the rise of environmentalism, and then punctuated 1971 when President Richard Nixon took the US dollar off the gold reserve system, destroying a fixed exchange rate global financial system that allowed for long-term investments like these kinds of projects I've discussed. So let's move on to the drought itself, but go back 2,000 years. There's a book published in 2013 called The West Without Water by two paleoclimatologists at the University of California, Berkeley. And the theme of the book is that the general characteristic climate for the Southwest and especially California over the past 2,000 years has been alternating mega floods and mega droughts, some of these droughts lasting a century. Okay? And the authors of the book hypothesize that with the current drought then underway in California, which actually became a 5-year drought in that period, that perhaps the climate of the Southwest and in California specifically is returning to the more characteristic climate that nature has created of alternating mega floods and mega droughts. And even though the authors give a little bit of lip service to the issue of human-caused climate change, CO2, and its role, the authors make very clear that they don't know, but they highly suspect that the present drought, and as we get to the discussion of the Colorado River system, that this present drought may just be a return to that more characteristic climate of the last 2 millennia. So so let's look at the current drought and the water crisis. And I want to combine both the developments in California with those in the Colorado River Basin. The water crisis is the worst in state history, 170 years. And what does that mean? It means that the water supply, especially to agriculture, has been virtually cut off to tens of thousands of farmers. The California State Water Board, which makes the decisions on how much will be distributed to which water districts and how will it be distributed, has made one ruling after another, not only this year, but last year, cutting off entire agricultural regions of the state from withdrawing water from any of the aqueducts or even the rivers or streams that flow, for example, right next to a farmer's fields. And what that means already this year, more than 800,000 acres have been fallowed of California agriculture. And California farmland is among the top few best farmland in the world. California grows more than 400 different crops. As I said earlier, more than half of the fruit and vegetables grown in the country are grown in California. So it's not just affecting California, it's affecting the nation's food supply. And we'll see a little bit more of that in a moment when we move to the Colorado River and the 7 states that share the Colorado River along with the nation of Mexico. Because in Arizona, next door to California, you have in the Yuma, Arizona region, and a region that is called the winter salad bowl capital of the world. Right? Lettuce, broccoli, spinach, cauliflower, and other crops that you in the wintertime are able to get in Maine or Michigan or New York or anywhere else in the country. Somewhere around 80 to 90% of those winter grown crops in Arizona is, makes up that percentage of winter grown crops in the whole country. The rest will come from California, right? Florida has something, but it doesn't concentrate on those kind of vegetables, especially. Now, the Colorado River Basin has been in a mega drought since the year 2000. That's 22 years in drought, whereas, as I said, California has been in drought 10 of the last 14 years. Right? And the Colorado River, which has two major reservoirs, in fact, the two largest reservoirs in the whole country, right? That is Lake Mead and Lake Powell. Lake Mead, a little noisy outside. Lake Mead, was formed with the building of the Hoover Dam, and Lake Powell, upstream from Hoover Dam, is the second largest reservoir in the country. And you think about it, 40 million people in the 7 states of the Southwest depend upon the Colorado River for all their water, except for what can be pumped out of wells. More than 5 million people depend upon Hoover Dam and the Glen Canyon Dam for their electricity. More than 5 million acres of agricultural land is irrigated from the two reservoirs, right? Now, so what has been the result of the mega drought? Well, both Lake Mead and Lake Powell are down to about 25% capacity. Can you do any slides?
They said Texas, can't see them.
Well, people here could.
People here can see them.
Put them up. Go 1, 2, 3. Okay, we're going to see if we can get some slides up here.
I don't know the number.
There you go. That's okay, leave it. All right, this is the map of California, which shows,
Thank you.
it shows all of the, not all, but the several major water projects. The red one that goes all the way into California, that's the California State Project, water project. The blue, white kind of blue, is the Central Valley Project, where most of the water that's in the Central Valley Project goes to agriculture in the Central Valley. But the State Water Project, as you see the red go down into Southern California, is, as I said, about 800 miles long. And in fact, it is the largest infrastructure project ever built by a state in US history. Now, if you see the green one that comes from the right side of the state and goes into Los Angeles, that is the Los Angeles Aqueduct, completed in 1913, which provides about 1 million acre feet of water to the Los Angeles region. Now, there's several other projects there. I'm not going to go through those at this point. Can you go forward? Let's catch up a little bit with the slides. This is the review I wrote in 2014 of the West Without Water. It's available in the archive of Executive Intelligence Review. Go ahead. Okay, this is the U.S. Drought Monitor weekly report on intensity of drought on the nation, various regions, and in all the states. As you see here, and this is just the western states. In California, you have a big dark red colored section, which is the exceptional drought. That is the worst category of drought that is part of the measurement. The kind of bright red is extreme drought. And even up in Eastern Oregon, you see some of the exceptional drought and extreme drought, which right above California. But all of the area is either, except for the far northwest and a little bit of Montana, the entire region is in drought. So, all right, this is Shasta Reservoir, which is behind Shasta Dam. Also is part of the Central Valley Project. And in fact, it's where the Central Valley Project begins. It is the largest reservoir in California. And what you see here in a current map, just a month or two ago, is that the lake is about 25% of capacity, and huge, sections of what was covered by water is no longer covered by water. And here's Lake Mead behind the Hoover Dam, and it's about 25% of capacity. And you can see actually how much has disappeared. When you look into the water there, you see a boat. So it's about 150 feet of elevation of the lake, which has literally disappeared. Okay. And here's Lake Mead once again. The first photo on the left is from the year 2000. These are satellite photos, by the way. The middle one is 2021, and the far right one is 2022. Right? I mean, huge sections completely dried out. Okay, then, so let's return to the dialogue here a little bit. So what's being done? Right? Well, in California, not much, except conserve water, conserve water, conserve water. Right? And we're going to cut off more and more farmers, which they've done. Right? And what about the Colorado River, though? Okay? 40 million people depend on that river for their water, for their electricity, for their irrigation. Right? And the projects on the Colorado River are all built by and thus today run by the Bureau of Reclamation. That's the federal agency under the Interior Department. And so the Bureau of Reclamation is the final authority on how much water is allowed to be released, where it can go, etc. Now, in mid-June, the Bureau of Reclamation warned the 7 states of the Colorado River Basin that withdraw water. That is California, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, Wyoming. I didn't miss any, but anyway, so warned, the 7 states that they had to come to an agreement by August 15th. That is a week ago, a little more than a week ago. They had to come to an agreement by August 15th on how they will reduce their withdrawals from the river and the reservoirs by between 2 and 4 million acre feet. Now, an acre foot is about the size, or an acre foot of water is about the size of a football field with 1 foot of water. So think of 2 million football fields, you know, of water, or 4 million, right? It's a lot of water. Right? And normally, or say up until the year 2000, the flow of the river would be, you know, coming into both reservoirs would be about 15 million acre feet a year, the flow. And it was that in about 1999. Today, it's 11 million acre feet. But in the last 20 years, while the river's volume has declined, you know, by almost 1/3, the states and Mexico have continued to withdraw the allocation that they agreed to many, many years ago. That's why the reservoirs are down to 25% of normal or of full. Right? Now, over the last 2 months then, as the states were warned that you come to an agreement on how you're going to cut 2 to 4 million acre feet, or the Bureau of Reclamation will step in and impose its own policy. Right? Now, so August 15th came and went. The states could not come to any agreement on who's going to get cut and how much. And the Bureau of Reclamation said, okay, we'll give you a little bit more time, but not very much, right? And so, I mean, think of it, 15 million acre feet is allocated, 11 million is flowing. You know, California gets 4.5 million acre feet. Most of that goes to the Imperial Valley agriculture. And Arizona gets about 2 million acre feet. Nevada gets 300,000 acre feet. And the upper basin states, Colorado, New Mexico, Utah, etc., they get, you know, somewhere 1 million or maybe a little less acre feet. So the big ones are California and Arizona. And you're going to cut 2 million or 4 million acre feet. That means it's going to be devastating cuts to agriculture in the Imperial Valley, you know, already, because the State Water Project, which normally sends about 3 million acre feet from Northern California into the Southern California, that has been completely shut down. They're getting zero from the State Water Project in Southern California now. And more than 4 million people in Southern California have already had significant restrictions on the water they can use in their homes and their businesses, etc. Right? So you get a good sense of this crisis. And what I, you know, rather than continuing with a lot of this, let's then look at what could have happened. You know, why this, you know, why this crisis is what it is. Well, I think droughts and major climate change are given to us by nature. How we humans respond to it is our decision. You know, do we plan for floods and droughts? Do we build the infrastructure required for such developments? You know, well, we used to do that. You know, that's what Franklin Roosevelt did. That's what John Kennedy did. And on the state level, Pat Brown did. And when the two projects were major projects were finished in California, 1972, the state had 20 million people. Today, it has 40 million people. And in 50 years, virtually zero water infrastructure has been built. But that's not just California. You know, that's the entire country. That's why, as Keisha mentioned, Hurricane Harvey was so devastating to Houston, where, I think it was several hundred people died in that flood. But on the books for Houston were projects of flood control that, had they been built over the last 30, 40 years, Houston would not have suffered that kind of flood damage and destruction. Right? It's the same in California. Right? In the 1960s, as California's water management system was coming to an actual completion, the people who were building it, both in the federal government and the state government, said, okay, this should last us 20 years or so. We'll have enough water for everybody and all the agriculture for the next 20 years. What are we going to do after that? In the 1990s. Well, there were two projects that were put on the table in the 1960s. The first was by President John Kennedy in 1962. He said, what we need to do is build nuclear-powered desalination plants beginning in California and Texas and Florida. Okay? And unfortunately and tragically, he was assassinated the next year. But in 1964, that program that he started was actually still alive. And in 1964, the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California signed a contract with the Atomic Energy Commission to build the first facility at Huntington Beach, California, the same place where the California Coastal Commission 2 months ago, vetoed the building of a large desalination plant, not nuclear powered, but a nice desalination plant that would produce 50,000 acres of water a year, right? So that was Kennedy's program. The other was called the North American Water and Power Alliance. And that policy was initiated by the Parsons Engineering Company of Pasadena. And it became, a celebrated, project that not only was there legislation in the Congress, and certain senators and members of the Congress were fighting for it, including Robert Kennedy before his assassination, okay? But also it was endorsed by the Prime Minister of Canada, because the North American Water and Power Alliance begins in Alaska. Northern Canada brings over 100 million acre feet of water down through what's called the Rocky Mountain Trench into the United States, and with two branches, one to the Midwest to refill the Ogallala Aquifer, and the other to the Southwest, including a line into the country of Mexico. Okay? Now, this project was moving in the mid-1960s. Okay? But what happened to Kennedy's program and NWAPA? Right? Well, again, it was the counterculture, the rise of environmentalism, the destruction of a productive financial monetary system that then slowly allowed such great projects, and I'm sure many other such projects around the country, just die from the from neglect, virtually, like a neglected child, who then becomes a criminal or just has a horrible life. So that's what could be done today. Immediately, there's not much that can be done except alleviate emergencies for small towns and individual farms whose wells go dry. And there's hundreds and hundreds of wells gone dry in California in this last year. Right? So there's alleviation measures. In the medium term, we could do what we did in 2017. Remember the Oroville Dam spillway that collapsed? Right? Well, what happened? 1 week after the spillway collapsed, the state of California signed a contract for the rebuilding of it. Another week, work had begun. And for the next year, that work was 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And the spillway was replaced in 1 year. The Carlsbad desalination plant, which was first proposed in the 1990s, finally got a permit to be built in 2014. And 1 year later, it was producing fresh water. We should build 30 of those kinds of plants in Southern California. Put a half a dozen in San Francisco Bay to pump directly into the aqueducts. Right? You know, these are the sort of things that we used to do and we have to do again. And that's where the political fight is. So I'll stop there, and I think Keisha will introduce Brian.
Because of time, I'm just going to go ahead and bring Brian in. Thank you very much, Pat. Again, welcome. Thank you, everyone, for joining this discussion. Water crisis. Let's drain the swamp. The mega drought in the USA. The real crisis, the real solution. So, Brian, I do want to say one thing is, as I mentioned in introducing Pat and his weekly report, another thing that's very critically important, I want to make sure people take the time to look at Brian Lance. If you go on to the LaRouche PAC website, both Pat Ruckert and Brian Lance have a column. And if you go to authors, you'll see the various speeches and reports that they do. And one of Brian's reports that he has done is a 44-page report on rebuilding the national infrastructure, physical economy. And I'd encourage people to read that. We'll make that available in, as said, the post-production, the YouTube of this broadcast, and also I will make it available online as well. You can find that under Brian Lance. So it's an excellent report on how to build out infrastructure projects and the question of the labor force, what's needed to build our productive economy. And I would, as said, encourage people to take a look at that. But without further ado, I want Brian to come up and talk to us.
Okay, so you gotta figure out how to do this here. Okay, about like yay, huh?
Yeah.
All right, well, you know, let's just say that the drought, picking up from Pat Ruckert, you know, the drought is a wake-up call across the western states, and of course that's come all the way here into the plains, into Texas, and the picture overall, you know, changes by the day. We know that. Suddenly we're deluged with rain here in Southeast Texas. But that goes to exactly to the point that Keisha raised with Hurricane Harvey. You know, when there's too much water, too little water, the point is we've known for 100 years, you know, at least hundreds of years. If you take mankind, you could say thousands of years, we've known how to move water from where there's too much of it to where there's too little, you know, to solve these problems. So the point is, we have the capability. You know, the question is willpower. You know, again, this question of leadership. So I think that's really important. Secondly, I want to emphasize, particularly in the context of where we are and looking north up through the Great Plains, is that really what we're talking about here in terms of the future of the country and developing the country is knitting the country together. That's what we've really got to be about. It's not a question of political parties or this or that. But if the MAGA movement, if the Trump movement, if American patriots are going to succeed in 22 and in 2024, we're going to have to come forward with programs, policies, and begin implementing these policies starting in January of 2023 to get the country moving again, to begin producing again, solving these problems again. So I'm going to go through a little bit of this quickly in terms of where we are. The first thing I want to just emphasize is how we've gone downhill in a different way than Pat was discussing it. But it's, it's a reflection, it's the same process. We're using less water today than in 1970. Not because of the drought, we're just using less water. Per capita, water use in industry, municipalities has been falling since 1975. We don't have industry, right? It was offshored, we deindustrialized and so on and so forth. You can go through the picture. We're not utilizing water. We need, looking to the future, we've got to expand water supplies. We have to solve the droughts with desalination. We have to develop other sources, and I'll refer to some of that as we go forward. But we really have to recognize that, and I'm drawing my figures from the U.S. Geological Survey in terms of the decrease in per capita water utilization. They're not average for the whole country. We're using less, we're applying less water productively, and that has real consequences. And then I want to emphasize that, this question of rural America as well, bringing that into the picture. Our counties, the counties here up through the plains, the South and so forth, rural counties is where we have the greatest poverty. Well, one of the biggest contributors to that is farmers don't make money. They lose money. The average American farmer, in terms of farm income, last year lost $1,314. That's what he made in the farm. He's got a day job. He's got, his wife is working in the town, or virtual. His kids are working. The income is coming from off the farm. Farmers are subsidizing our food. Now that's one aspect of it, but the other aspect of it is, well, then what's the condition of the rural communities? What's happening to our towns and cities? Throughout the Plains region, down through the Plains were growing up into 2007, 2008 with the last financial crisis. Population was growing at the same rate as it was across the country. Now it's declining. These are real consequences of real policies, which can be reversed. What do farmers need? They need water. They need energy, cheap energy, to drive water projects, to develop the land. One of the biggest features of what we've got here in terms of the drought through the Plains states, I'll come to in a second, is irrigation. If farmers don't have irrigation out there, growing their hay, growing their wheat, etc., well, then they're at the mercy of nature. Well, obviously, that's something we have to change. We got to drought-proof the country. That's one way of thinking about this. At the same time, we have to waterproof it. So we have to do, but that's infrastructure. That's a question of the kind of investment that Pat was talking about. So let's just go to, if you can, go to the first slide. I'm gonna move here. We're talking about food. I want to just introduce people directly to the Great Plains, because we have people around the country here that are on this webcast. Okay, I'll go ahead and start. People in this room, people otherwise have an idea of where the Great Plains is. Well, the Great Plains, this was a product of the American system. You know, we bought it, most of the Great Plains, the entire Great, you know, this is an area of 500, well, that's a different picture. That's not my picture, but anyway, the Great Plains, the Great Plains is 500 miles across. It's 2,000 miles long in the United States. Most of it was bought with the Louisiana Purchase. That's where it came from. You know, Lewis and Clark investigated it. Lincoln, it was Lincoln. It was the federal government. It was Lincoln built the Transcontinental Railroad, right? But it was also the Homestead Act, and it was the program for universities, the land grant colleges. All of that went into developing the Great Plains region. So, you know, this wasn't something where we just kind of sat back and said, well, let's see what happens with the country. We set out to develop it and really knit it together through the development of the plains and the Transcontinental Railroad and so forth. We weren't just hopping across to California to get the gold. We were filling in the country in between and developing it. And I think that's just really important in terms of thinking about what we have to do now. I have another slide up there, but sitting in the middle of the Great Plains, and that the Great Plains extends down into Texas, extends down to about the latitude of Austin, Texas. Yeah, you can hand some of those around. There's a series of slides. I made some copies here for people in case we had a problem here. In the middle of the Great Plains sits the High Plains, and that's more or less the equivalent of the Great Plains Aquifer, the Ogallala Aquifer, in terms of area, sitting in the middle of it. And it's called the High Plains because it's, you know, 5,000 to 6,000 feet in terms of height, but it's essentially a plateau, and it was created by the crumbling away of the Rocky Mountains on the east side, the erosion over time, and that gravel, that rock, sediment, all of that spread out over that area, spread by water and so on and so forth, and trickling down through that wet water, and that water built up the aquifers. So that's just by way of geography. So what's the agricultural situation here? Well, first of all, I mean, cattle. The U.S. national cattle herd, according to the USDA, as of July, is down 2%. We've lost 2% of our cattle herd this year. The drought spreading in across the plains, you know, 40–50% of the cattle in the United States is in this region. Probably all told, if you take into account the Dakotas, the northern plains, it's probably more than that. But over 40% is here, Texas, Kansas, and the rest. The feed prices are up 20% this year. Hay prices, well, hay prices, you know, they're up 50% in some places. Okay, here's the aquifer. Here's thanks, Hunter. Hunter Cobb is managing these slides, getting this working. You could okay, but hay prices are up double, triple, quadruple if you can find it. It depends on the area. But again, this comes down back to the question of water. Okay. I want to add another element to this in terms of.
Sorry, I can't hear you. 1 second.
Oh, lost the sound. Well, I wanted to add in an element here in terms of the cattle situation. I'm trying to move quickly here. The 22 calf crop is coming in at about 35 million head. The calf crop is, of course, you know, those that then are going to be raised, and they're going to become your next, you know, they're going to be the next round of cattle going to the feeder lots and then on to the onto the meat packing place. Well, 35 million. Well, in 1995, it was 40 million. To get a sense, and this is a broader problem, than just 1 year in the drought or 2 years or whatever. We have a declining per capita protein intake in the United States, a declining average diet in the United States. And so I want to bring that into the picture, that just to reference that in a clear way. If we go to wheat briefly, well, the wheat total wheat production in Texas this year is down 53% from the drought, 53%. Oklahoma is down 37%. And the total hard red winter wheat crop is down 21% for the whole country. So these are significant drops in terms of wheat. Corn, just to mention it, corn, soybeans, because of better weather into the Midwest, into Iowa, Illinois, and so on and so forth. It looks like overall, even though these crops have suffered it here in the plains and Dakotas as part of the Great Plains, the soybean and corn crop could come in at better than average. So, so we have a mixed picture. I just want to make that clear. But wheat, we've been hit, particularly here in Texas in the South. And then cotton. Cotton is something people may not think about very much. But in terms of the United States, the cotton production this year is going to be down 29%. In the Southwest, our immediate area here, it's going to be contributing 28% of total production, when it normally contributes 50%. 67% of the cotton fields have been abandoned in the Southwest. Abandoned. Just, they just had to walk away from it. Now, again, this is a question of infrastructure, energy, right? Water. All right, so if you could go on to the next slide. I want to bring up in terms of this question of water and energy, this is the 1968 Texas water plan. Now, this was not some scheme. This was backed by the governor of the state, Connolly, supported it, promoted it. It was signed off on by the Bureau of Reclamation. It involved the Louisiana Department of Public Works, State Engineers Office of New Mexico, the Mississippi River Commission, et cetera, et cetera. And this was to bring, on the far right, you're bringing water in through two canals, the Trans-Texas Canal across the top, if you can see it there, running across the top from left to right, bringing water from the Mississippi across, utilizing reservoirs and so forth along the way, all the way into the Ogallala Aquifer, into the High Plains Aquifer. And then you have the coastal canal coming down the coast, also bringing water in from the Mississippi and all the way south into the southern part of Texas, South Texas. This project failed passage. It needed $3.5 billion to be built, coming from Texas citizens. It failed by 6,000 votes in the entire state in 1969. That was the Vietnam War. That was, people were beginning to get pessimistic. Government was beginning to cut back, right? Anyway, there was a changing of the attitudes that was going on at that time. But nonetheless, we thought big. 15 nuclear power plants. This was the Bureau of Reclamation's not only assessment, but their proposal 15 nuclear power plants would drive that water from east to west across the Trans-Texas Canal. That's going uphill. You're not, this is not flat. You're moving uphill. All right. I want to point out here as well, in 2018, 2019, Dr. Hal Cooper, old friend of ours, the late Hal Cooper, great engineer, came here working with Keisha Rogers and her congressional campaign against Al Green. And we won't talk about him. We discussed, if you see in the bright red in the far right-hand, upper right-hand corner of the map, you have two major reservoirs, the Sam Rayburn and the Toledo Bend Reservoir, which provides some great bass fishing and a little water management, and that's about it. These, the Toledo Bend is the biggest water reservoir in the entire South, and Sam Rayburn ain't much behind it. These are huge reservoirs, not on the scale of Lake Mead, but 4.5 million acre feet. You could bring water from those reservoirs, particularly the Sam Rayburn, because that's entirely in the state of Texas and was financed by the state of Texas. You could bring water from there down into the basically at a at a diagonal into the South Texas, and utilize it through a series of reservoirs in between for water management as well. So just to mention that kind of conception, and I would point out, we held a major conference on water at that point with Hal Cooper, and we presented what could be done in Houston. The tunneling under the city to move water out of the city, and as Hal Cooper, Dr. Cooper promoted, then you build water treatment plants. You bring that water out under those tunnels, and then you treat that water in a preliminary way, and then you can move it south. In other words, you utilize the water when there's too much. And then we have the resources. I'm just pointing to some of it, the pipeline resources. And this is something that's going on, of course, around the Great Plains, from the Dakotas to Kansas. There's discussions, pipeline projects being built and so forth to attempt to manage the situation. But I want to move on to desalinization. And specifically, you can move on to the next slide when you have a chance there. I want to talk about a specific aspect of desalinization, which is desalinization in the inland areas. And this includes Texas. I mean, if you take the water, the bond issue monies for water projects in the state of Texas, it became a minor scandal, or should be a major, but minor scandal, that where 10% of the money was supposed to go to rural towns and communities out of the water fund, only 1% has been going to rural communities. I think there's an effort now to address that by the Governor Abbott and others. But the point is, we're not doing what we need to do, and we have the potential to do a lot more. This is an example of this. This comes from the proposal that we developed. A number of our young colleagues at the time, working with specialists around the country, developed an upgraded NWAPA program. It was mentioned by Pat earlier briefly, but a particular feature of that in preparation for NWAPA was the development of inland nuclear desalinization plants for desalinating groundwater, what otherwise gets called brackish water. And that was for the treatment the Colorado River sends 9 tons of sodium of salts down to Mexico. Okay, some of it gets caught and treated, some of it works, some of the projects there try to limit it. Of course, it has effects on irrigation, on crop yield, and so on and so forth. But you have a sodium problem. A lot of it's just natural. Gypsum, rock salt, what we call rock salt. It's in sediment. It's in the rock formations. So rivers, but also aquifers. We think of the water table as where you drill down to whatever that point is, and here in South Texas, it's pretty close to the surface, and you come to the water table. But how far down does it go? And what is it composed of? If you talk about an aquifer, even the Ogallala, people have, I think, a concept that a aquifer is some big hole underground, that fills up with water, and there you got your aquifer. No, it's stratified. It's layers. It's in sediment. Separated by different materials that as continuous materials break it up. And so, like for example, under the southern Ogallala, over the Panhandle of Texas, you have the Duncan aquifer, otherwise known as the Santa Rosa aquifer. It's underneath the Ogallala aquifer. It's brackish water. It's salty water. Go on to the next slide if you can. Across the entire country, the whole country, we have layers of water, brackish water in particular, that's the technical term for it, that can be desalinated. In other words, at the very moment we're saying we don't have water, well, we have lots of water. And I'm not saying this is an infinite amount, but according to the US Geological Survey, it's like 180 times what we use in a year that we know of in brackish water. Just, as a figure, these things change. But so if you look here at this map, down the middle of it, right, down through the Great Plains, what do you have? You have all that brown, those light tan colors. Well, that's brackish water that's less than 20 feet underground. You can see the color code at the bottom there. I hope it can focus enough for you to see the color code. But the idea is primarily to get the concept of that. Also, of course, in the Central Valley, out in California and so forth, we have 3 to 4 billion acre feet of water under Texas. There's 8 billion in the aquifers in California. There's 600 million acre feet in Arizona. They're trying to figure out how to develop desal plants there. So my point here is that we are not without means, but again, it's a matter of mobilizing the resources. And this is where the national bank, national credit come in. We didn't develop the Great Plains, by watching it. We went in and built it. That was fundamentally, that was the greenback policy of Abraham Lincoln. He printed the money. There was no Federal Reserve. He said, we're going to make these projects work. There's much more to it in terms of the ins and outs of it, all that, but in terms of the transcontinental itself. But these were the sorts of initiatives that the United States took, and we need to take today. You can't do it with the Federal Reserve system. Money printed from the Federal Reserve does not go to banks, community banks, in Abilene, or anywhere else. The money that goes, that goes out of the Federal Reserve through their designated partnership financial institutions. There's about 40 of them right now. that money flows into the financial markets. That's where it goes. What we need is to return to the American system where money, credit is extended to unleash the productive capacities of our people. And those people are across this nation. So, desal is an extremely important aspect for inland water development. And I just want to underscore this. James Consa, writing in Forbes, July 2019, promoting small modular nuclear reactors of the sort that we could utilize to build desal plants on the West Coast, had this to say, the scientist: whatever technologies are selected, Southern California needs to build the equivalent of 30 desalination plants the size of Carlsbad's to produce over 1 billion gallons a day, solving most of the water problems of Southern California. He was writing this in 2019. The Central Valley, which Pat was talking about, the Central Valley would need another 30 plants to deal with its agricultural needs as its groundwater is becoming increasingly salty. Now, the point is not to debate 30, 50, 60, whatever. The point is to get the idea that this is the scale, this is how we have to be thinking about it in terms of approaching the inland areas of the United States. Right? We have a principle in operation here. It's not simply salt water, but it's groundwater combined. And just to point out, we have 27 major aquifers just under the state of Texas. The state has carried out over a period of years, I think it's still ongoing, several $1 million with every disbursement, by the state legislature, a complete survey of all the aquifers. So just to say that, and then to add very quickly, El Paso, if you're not aware of it, El Paso has a saltwater it's called the K. Bailey Hutchinson desalination plant. It has a capacity of 27.5 million gallons a day, 30,000 acre feet a year. And it is the, anyway, a very large, it's about more than half the size, or about half the size of the Carlsbad plant in California. San Antonio has a plant that will be at 30 million gallons a day. The HT Oaks Aquifer plant, the first stage of that's completed, it's pumping, they're desalinating brackish water. The plant in El Paso, of all places, that's inland, it's pumping brackish water from about 24 different wells, brackish wells. So, this is not hypothetical or whatever, it's being done. This can be expanded. And if you're thinking about, okay, if this drought is going to continue over the next several years, we don't know. We don't know how this is going to develop. But if we're looking at this, but we're also looking to the future in terms of developing our agricultural output, our productivity, the wealth of our family farmers, with, where they could maybe actually make a profit, make a living as farmers, then these projects are what we have to get on with, and irrigate as well as provide energy throughout the Great Plains region. So I think that brings me just briefly to discuss. I mean, we have coming online, or soon, hopefully, Generation 4 nuclear power plants. We have Generation 3 being completed. That's the Vogtle nuclear power plants in Georgia, the two big AP 1000 nuclear power plants. That's Generation 3 plus. We're now on the verge of going to Generation 4, which has to be accelerated. Again, this is a question of national initiative. Generation 4 4 plants will give us the ability to build nuclear-powered agro-industrial complexes throughout the heartland of the United States. Our time is short here, but one of the biggest advantages of these 4th generation plants is they operate at 500 to 1,000 degrees Celsius. You know, a light water plant today works at 300, you know, like Comanche Peak or whatever. You're talking about 300 degrees Celsius. Well, at 500 to 1,000 degrees, particularly when you're getting up into that 1,000 degrees Celsius level, you have a humongous amount of thermal energy. A nuclear power plant only utilizes now about 30% of the energy that's released in the nuclear process. Okay, and in some places it's used for cogeneration. The thermal energy is utilized for cogeneration, you know, for in conjunction with refineries, heating of buildings, et cetera, et cetera. Get up to 500 to 1,000 Celsius. Okay, you can run steel mills, ammonia production for fertilizer, plus diesel. You can be doing all of this at once. And that's a point of moving with nuclear desalinization now. In the Great Plains, throughout the region that we've been showing here in these maps, these desal plants could simultaneously be cogeneration plants producing electricity. Here we have in this country, we have no electricity, right? I mean, we're worrying from one day to the next, are they going to keep the power on? You know, Governor Abbott's doing his best now to try to, you know, strap together, you know, and hold together the energy grid of just the state of Texas. But this is from New York State to California. Everybody is saying we're on the verge of blackouts and brownouts. I mean, this is public. If you haven't seen it, I mean, it's out there. You can just Google it, as they say, you know, and find out about it. Okay, well, look, so we need water, we need electricity, cogenerate. Let's do this. And of course, in some places we can run it on natural gas, you know, as we do in El Paso, you know, as they're doing in San Antonio. Natural gas, you know, combined cycle natural gas plants. But nuclear takes us to the next stage. Now, what we're doing when we're building all this out, if you go to the next slide, and I'll wrap here, I think I'm still roughly in time. Okay, is NWAPA itself, the North American Water and Power Alliance. You know, even in terms of treatment of groundwater, we have to look at this as an interim solution, because we're dealing with the drought in terms of what we can do in the interim. You know, wells can be drilled, brackish water can be treated. This is, you know, this is not rocket science, okay? But moving forward to build, you know, this is back from the Kennedy era, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the projects that were being proposed then. And I might mention that the first industrial desalinization plant was in Freeport, Texas. It was turned on by President John F. Kennedy pushing a button in the White House. The vice president, you know, Johnson, you can imagine, was right there in Freeport to have it turned on. That was in 1962. You can find a video of it, of Kennedy's speech. And that was the precursor of the nuclear desalinization program that kicked off once they, you know, with DuPont, the corporation, had built this desal plant, and it worked, right? And it produced, it was after a drought period in Texas. And so DuPont wanted water for its industry along the Gulf, and they wanted it inland. Well, we can go on a bigger scale. You know, we can go to 4 or 5 gigawatts. Complexes producing ammonia, desalinization for large agricultural areas. All of that combined into one project. You can see at the top there of this schematic some of what is combined here in this proposed project. This is forward thinking that we had up until the assassination of John F. Kennedy. On to the next slide, and we'll get to Nawapi here, and we'll wrap here with that. And I appreciate your kind attention to this. Nawapa, okay, we're talking about bringing water from the rivers, Yukon, Mackenzie, and so forth, bringing them down, bringing water, just 20%. This water just drains off into the Arctic. It's not utilized now, just drains out there into the ocean, Arctic Ocean, into the ocean and otherwise, and instead bringing it south, down through the Rocky Mountain Trench, moving it, in some cases pumping it, in other places boring holes through, to move the water through the mountains, and bringing it south, a total of 200 million acre feet, thereabout, 150, 200 million acre feet. And then you see it splitting off. Next slide, please. Yeah, splitting off. Yeah. There's a better map. Now you can see there, as we've developed it in terms of the Nawapa 21 proposal, the nuclear Nawapa 21 proposal, substituting nuclear power for hydroelectric, so you're not wasting the hydroelectric, wasting on hydroelectric power what you need you want to bring south otherwise. You see the High Plains extension, and that brings water across the prairie states, the Great Plains section that's up there in Canada, and brings it down. One part of it meets the Missouri and comes south into Kansas, and Kansas. Then we bring a canal down south over the aquifer, the Great Plains Ogallala Aquifer, all the way down to the Pecos River in Texas. Okay, another branch of it goes and links up ultimately with the Mississippi River. But you're talking about bringing something on the order of 20 million acre feet of water down through that canal into the prairie states, linking up with another approximate 20 million gallons from the Missouri. A lot of the Missouri River is just held back to manage flooding, so there's water there. The Missouri is about 80% this year, 80% of capacity. But with that 40 million or thereabouts, you're bringing that water on down through the Great Plains. But of course, as Pat Ruckert was developing very briefly, you're also bringing it down through the western states. And ultimately, you can link up with projects bringing water up from Mexico. So this is where we can go to ultimately solve our problems. And that water, that water flushes out the salt. You're not just managing the salt, you can flush it out. Just one final note, MIT actually, there's a project at MIT that's great, that's found a way to take brine, saltwater brine, and turn it into useful chemicals. So there's means of utilizing the salt, that you're pulling out of the water to purify the water. Not just the salt, I mean, it's a mix of minerals. It's called total dissolved solids is the actual term, TDS, that you're pulling out through desalinization to create fresh water. But out of Texas A&M, together with the University of Pennsylvania, they've discovered a way to increase the efficiency of the reverse osmosis desal plants by 30 to 40%, utilizing nanotechnology, down to the atom level. They've found that they can create better, more efficient, evenly distributed membranes that increase the throughput, the ability to pull the bad stuff, keep the bad stuff out, but let the good water through by 30 to 40%. This is just in the last year. So there's work going on, that can improve all of this. So I hope, adding to what Pat has developed, we have a lot of capability. We have a lot of potential as a nation.